Welcome once again to my office. Welcome to another weekly wow. I'm always glad to share together words, ideas, thoughts, especially words that assist us as we live in this world and as we prepare for a world that is far superior to the world in which we live here on planet Earth. I'm always glad to have you with me. Thank you so much for joining me. Our word this week is the word freedom. We talk a lot about freedom as a noun, but I want to think with you about freedom as a principle. I want to think with you about the freedom principle that Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 9. As I read the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, it seems that that church in Corinth had more than their fair share of problems, especially considering that it was a relatively new church, immature people. When you have problems, you need solutions. And so some of the church in Corinth, some of the members of the church, had written to Paul seeking advice. The questions Paul addresses in the first half of the book: division, human allegiances, dependence on human wisdom and power, worldliness, tolerating immorality, questions of lawsuits between Christians, sexual immorality, marital concerns, meat sacrificed to idols. All of these had potential for generating significant conflict within the church. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul begins to set forth a principle base to deal with those problems. Problems are best resolved by establishing and understanding the principles, agreement on the guidelines and the norms of the Christian life. Paul writes, if I might paraphrase, that he uses the freedom principle to guide his life. His freedom allows him to enslave himself for God's purposes. He uses his freedom, living by the freedom principle, to identify with others, not to draw lines, not to separate himself from others. His freedom opens possibilities for saving as many as possible for the sake of the gospel. Paul's freedom actually depreciates his rights, increases his responsibilities, demands self-discipline, and leads to stricter living. How different is that than the self-focused freedom that many seek in our world today? Christian freedom is not a freedom focused on self, but is a freedom focused on God's will. Not a demand for rights, but a willingness to do whatever is necessary for the sake of the gospel. I'll mention briefly that much of what I've just shared as we introduce this week's Wow comes from my little book, Dwelling in the Word, the study of 1 Corinthians chapter 9 on page 156. The New Testament echoes the contrast that I'm addressing: freedom from versus freedom for. The big question for us as Christians is freedom for what? Freedom to do what? Freedom is for Paul a principle that guides life. Paul's freedom principle contrasts sharply with the freedom many want today. The freedom principle Paul is describing lets me give up my rights for the benefit and well-being of others. The freedom principle Paul is describing allows me to put minimal resources toward my own desires and needs in order to share the gospel more broadly. My freedom principle, as I live as Paul describes, allows me to be all that God calls me to be, even though it may limit me. Paul describes freedom from sin as being enslaved to God in Romans chapter 6, verse 22. So freedom, liberty is not only a noun. It's not just something that someone has or does not have. This freedom we're talking about, this freedom or liberty, is a guiding principle for life. Paul says he is free to make himself a slave. What a paradox. An older saying is memorable. Everyone is a slave to something. The question is, to what are you enslaved? This week's challenge, when you talk about, pray about, make plans focused on freedom, make sure to include freedom to, not just freedom from. Freedom from may be good and desirable, but freedom for and freedom to are wonderfully fulfilling for us as Christians. And I might say, in another paradox, they're also wonderfully freeing. Remember that God loves you, I love you. That's the way it's going to be. Freedom as a principle to guide our life. Until next week, may God bless us as we seek to serve Him.